Renee Corthy crouched low behind the jagged black ridge, the chill of the alien wind needling her through her tactical bodysuit. Her ship was safely hidden 2 kilometers away, camouflaged within a thicket of towering crystal spires. This planet, its name unpronounceable in her native tongue, was the end of the line. After months of chasing rumors and false leads, she'd finally found him. Elias Moreau had gone to ground here, and she had no doubt that he knew she was close. He always seemed to know. A man like that, living on the run, must have senses honed to an almost unnatural degree. She adjusted her mask, its display feeding her a stream of data. No sign of movement below. The forest spread out like a dark, unbroken carpet, the air filled with the faint hum of life forms just out of range. She toggled through her scanner's modes: thermal, electromagnetic, motion, but the terrain gave nothing away. Anything? The voice in her earpiece startled her. She tapped it once to lower the volume. "Not yet," she replied, keeping her voice low. "He's too good. He'll wait until I make a mistake." "I wouldn't count on it," her handler Carvin said dryly. "Just be sure you don't let him out of your sight this time. The council's not exactly patient." "As if I need reminding," Renee muttered, cutting the connection. She stayed motionless, letting her senses take over where technology failed. Somewhere down there, Elias was likely doing the same. Every intel report on him described a man who could blend into any environment, outthink any hunter, and somehow survive in places where even Azrani patrols feared to tread. Yet Renee had spent her entire career tracking targets deemed untraceable. She'd never failed. A rustle to her left snapped her out of her thoughts. She dropped lower, her eyes narrowing on a cluster of ferns swaying against the wind's direction. Slowly, she brought up her rifle. She didn't fire. Not yet. "Nice form," a voice said from behind her, calm and even. "But you're pointing in the wrong direction." Renee spun, her weapon coming up in one fluid motion, but Elias was already gone. The only sign of his passing was the faintest rustle of leaves. Her pulse quickened, more from frustration than fear. He was toying with her, just as he had the last 2 times she'd almost caught him. "Keep playing these games," she called out into the thick silence, "and I'll make sure you regret it." No response. She lowered the rifle but didn't holster it. Instead, she moved slowly down the slope, boots silent against the mossy ground. If Elias thought he could outmaneuver her, he'd soon find out just how wrong he was. The forest closed in around her, the light dimming under the canopy. Every step was calculated. She knew he was close, too close. He wanted her to follow, to be led right into whatever trap he'd set. But Renee wasn't about to let him dictate the rules. She paused by a fallen tree, crouching again to scan the surroundings. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the one doing the hunting anymore. "Do you always talk to yourself? Or is that just something you do when you're losing?" Elias's voice came from somewhere behind the tree this time. She didn't answer. Instead, she lunged forward, over the trunk, rifle ready. But once again, there was nothing there. Renee let out a slow breath, forcing her frustration down. He was baiting her, trying to break her focus. That was fine. If he thought she'd be goaded into a mistake, he didn't know her well enough yet. "I'm not going anywhere, you know," Elias called from deeper into the forest. His voice carried a hint of amusement. "You might as well come have a chat." Renee adjusted her earpiece, muting it entirely. If she had to hear one more smug remark, she might actually take the shot the next time he appeared. Mission parameters be damned. "I don't need to chat," she said under her breath. "I just need you to stop running." She pushed onward, staying low, the forest pressing closer with every step. Renee stayed silent, perched high on a low, sprawling branch as she scanned the dense foliage below. The sound of a stream trickling nearby masked the faint footsteps she'd been tracking. She adjusted her rifle, keeping it aimed toward the underbrush, and glanced at the trail marker on her visor's display. Elias was close, too close for comfort. She wasn't sure why he hadn't bolted yet, given the escape opportunities he'd had. "Maybe he's tired of running," she murmured to herself, not quite believing it. A sharp snap of a twig made her tense. Her grip tightened on the rifle as a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Elias. The creature was low-slung, its pale body blending with the forest floor. A six-limbed predator, its back ridged with bioluminescent spines, sniffed the air as it crept toward her position. Renee remained still, watching it sniff the base of her tree. Then it snarled, a guttural sound that seemed to echo for miles. "I wouldn't move if I were you," a familiar voice called out. "Elias." Renee's eyes flicked up. She spotted him perched on a similar branch a dozen meters away, his long coat blending with the tree bark. He didn't have a weapon in his hands, just a faintly amused expression. The predator below swung its head toward him, growling louder. "Let it come to you," Elias said, his voice calm, as if this was something he'd done 100 times before. Then, when it's close enough. She didn't let him finish. Renee brought her rifle down and fired, a clean shot that sent the predator crumpling to the ground. She didn't wait to admire her aim. Swinging down from her perch, she landed a few meters away from the body, rifle still at the ready. Only then did she glance at Elias again. "Is that what you were going to suggest?" she asked dryly. "Or were you going to let me find out the hard way?" Elias grinned. "I would have stepped in eventually, but you handled it." Renee kept her weapon up, not ready to trust the relaxed manner he carried himself with. "What are you doing here, Elias?" "Admiring the scenery," he said, hopping down from his branch. He didn't approach her, but he didn't move away either. "You know, for someone who's supposed to capture me, you sure are making this hard on yourself." "I'm making it hard?" Renee lowered her rifle slightly, still cautious. "You've been leading me in circles for days. If you just—" "What?" Elias interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "If I'd just come quietly? Hand myself over to the Israni Empire and hope they go easy on me? You and I both know that's not how this works." Renee's fingers tightened on the stock of her rifle. "You can't keep running forever. Maybe not, but you can't keep chasing forever either." He gestured to the fallen predator. "And if I'd left you alone, that thing would have had you for dinner. You're welcome, by the way." She glared at him. "I didn't need your help." "No, I suppose not," Elias said lightly. "You're the best, after all. Azrani's finest hunter. That's what they tell everyone. Isn't it?" Renee felt her jaw clench. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Elias said, his tone suddenly more serious. He stepped a little closer, his hands still in plain sight. "I know you're not just here because you were ordered to be. You could have handed this off to someone else, but you didn't. You came yourself." "Because it's my job," she replied sharply. "That's all." "Sure," Elias said, a hint of doubt in his voice. "If that's what you need to tell yourself." Renee frowned, lowering her rifle a fraction more. "Why are you even still talking to me? You've had plenty of chances to disappear, but you haven't." "Why?" Elias gave her a long look, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I just like the company." Before she could respond, he turned and started walking back into the trees. Renee hesitated, watching his figure fade into the shadows. For the first time, she felt unsure of what her next move should be. Renee trailed behind Elias as the forest thinned into a stretch of rolling hills covered in pale, swaying grass. Her rifle remained slung over her shoulder, but her hand never strayed far from it. The chase had turned into a tense stalemate. He didn't run, and she didn't pounce. For now, they walked in an uneasy truce. "I'd ask what you were thinking, following me like this," Elias said, breaking the silence. "But I already know the answer." "I'm here to do a job," Renee replied, keeping her eyes on his back. "It's not personal." He stopped suddenly and turned to face her. "Not personal? Really?" Renee froze, her fingers twitching toward her weapon. Elias didn't move to attack. He simply stood there, watching her with a mix of amusement and curiosity. "Do you always talk like that when you're in the field?" he asked. "So detached, so professional. Never once wondering if there's another way." "This is the way," she said firmly. "You're a fugitive. I'm here to bring you in." That's it. Elias shook his head, then started walking again, his pace slow and deliberate. If that's all it is, why haven't you pulled the trigger yet? I'm not exactly hiding anymore. Renee opened her mouth to respond but found she didn't have a clear answer. She'd asked herself that question more than once since encountering him face to face. His calm demeanor, the quiet intelligence in his eyes, it made it harder to see him as just another target. Maybe I'm just waiting for the right moment, she said, masking her hesitation. Maybe I'm testing you. Testing me? Elias smirked, looking over his shoulder. You sure you're not testing yourself? Renee felt her jaw tighten. What is that supposed to mean? It means that you're not the first Israni hunter to come after me, but you're the only one who's stuck around this long, Elias said. If it were just about the job, you'd have moved on by now. So what is it, Renee? What's keeping you here? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she scanned the horizon, taking in the way the grass rippled in the breeze. Her training told her to never let her guard down, never let a target get inside her head. But Elias's question lingered, unanswered. They walked in silence for a while longer, the tension thickening with each step. Eventually, they reached a shallow ravine. Elias descended carefully, his boots crunching against loose stones. Renee followed, her instincts on high alert. When they reached the bottom, he stopped again and gestured to a cluster of rocks. We'll camp here for the night, he said, dropping his pack. There's a stream not far from here. I'll get water. Renee raised an eyebrow. You're awfully comfortable giving orders. Not orders, Elias said. Suggestions. Feel free to ignore them, though you might get thirsty. She huffed, leaning against a boulder. I'm not here to make camp with you. I'm here to bring me in, he finished for her. Yes, you've made that very clear. But since you haven't done it yet, we might as well avoid dehydration. I'll be back. Elias turned and walked toward the sound of running water, leaving Renee alone with her thoughts. She debated following him, watching his every move, but ultimately stayed put. Something about his attitude, unhurried, almost casual, unsettled her. He didn't act like a fugitive on the run. He acted like someone who had nothing to lose. When Elias returned with a small pouch of water, he tossed it to her. Drink. Even the best hunters need to stay hydrated. Renee caught it but didn't immediately drink. What's your angle? No angle, he said, settling against the rocks. Just making sure we both survive the night. This planet's not exactly friendly, in case you hadn't noticed. She eyed him warily, then took a sip from the pouch. The water was cold and refreshing, and she realized how dry her throat had gotten during the trek. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Elias was playing some kind of game, one she hadn't quite figured out yet. So, what happens after this? She asked, breaking the silence. Elias leaned back, resting his hands behind his head. Depends on you. I'll keep walking. You'll keep following. Maybe one of us finally makes a move, or maybe we keep doing this dance a little longer. I don't mind, really. The company's not bad. Renee frowned. You're not taking this seriously. Sure I am, he said, his tone light. Just not the way you want me to. She set the pouch down and stared at him. You can't keep this up forever. Neither can you, Elias said, his voice softening. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. For once, Renee didn't have a snappy retort. She shifted her gaze to the horizon, wondering how much longer this chase could go on, and what would happen when it finally ended. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns onto the forest floor. Renee and Elias walked side by side now, the strained silence replaced by occasional remarks. Neither had acknowledged that they'd stopped acting like enemies, but it was obvious in the way their pace fell in step, in the way they exchanged looks rather than threats. This planet doesn't have a name? Elias asked, breaking the quiet. Renee shrugged. Not one we use, just a designation code. The Israni don't name every rock they survey. Seems like a missed opportunity, Elias replied, scanning their surroundings. A place this untouched deserves something more than a string of numbers. Renee cast him a sideways glance. What would you call it? Elias paused, running a hand over the rough bark of a nearby tree. Something that fits. Maybe Solvaya, like it catches the sun's spirit. That sounds ridiculous, she said, but her tone lacked the edge it once had. You humans always romanticize everything. Is that what we do? Elias smiled faintly. And what is it that Azrani do then? We see things as they are, she replied, stepping carefully over a tangle of roots. We focus on the purpose, not the poetry. Sounds exhausting, he remarked, his tone playful. Renee didn't respond immediately. She let the conversation hang as they moved deeper into the forest. But after a while, she said, "It's just different. We're different." Elias nodded. That much is clear. But different doesn't mean incompatible. You're awfully optimistic for someone who's been hunted across half the galaxy, she said. It's not optimism, Elias countered. It's pragmatism. We're here now, walking together. Why not make the best of it? Renee found herself without a retort. He had a way of dismantling her arguments without being confrontational, which irritated her more than it should. She wasn't used to having her convictions challenged, especially by someone like him. They reached a clearing where a small creek flowed, its gentle babble breaking the silence. Elias knelt by the water, cupping it in his hands. Clear enough to drink, he said after a moment. Renee remained standing, watching him. You're not worried about contaminants? Not everything out here is trying to kill us, Elias replied. Just most things. A small smile tugged at her lips, though she quickly forced it down. You seem comfortable out here. I had to learn fast, Elias said, standing and wiping his hands on his pants. A life on the run means adapting quickly or not surviving at all. I suppose that's something we have in common, Renee admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Elias tilted his head. You? On the run. Not in the same way, she clarified. But you don't make it far as a hunter without being able to think on your feet. My training taught me to adapt to any environment. And yet, Elias said, stepping closer, you keep following me instead of taking me down. Why is that? Her expression hardened. You're still my target. Don't mistake this temporary alliance for a change of heart. I wouldn't dream of it, Elias said, a teasing edge to his voice. But it does make me wonder what you're really after. Renee turned away, scanning the tree line. Don't flatter yourself. I'm after the bounty. Right? Elias said softly. The bounty. They moved again, the conversation fading into silence once more. Renee tried to focus on her surroundings, but Elias's words lingered. She hated that he had a point. She'd had opportunities to end this, to end him, but she hadn't taken them. And now, walking side by side with him, she was starting to question why. The forest gave way to a rocky incline, and they climbed without speaking. When they reached the top, the view opened up to reveal rolling hills that seemed to stretch endlessly. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers. For a moment, they simply stood there, taking it all in. It's beautiful, Elias said, his voice quiet. Renee nodded. It is. Elias turned to her. Maybe you don't have to bring me in. Maybe there's another way. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Another way would mean betraying everything I've worked for. Or it could mean finding something worth more than what you're working for, he said, his tone calm but firm. It's your choice. Renee frowned, looking back at the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, the silence between them heavy with unspoken possibilities. For the first time in years, she felt uncertain of her next step. The air grew cooler as dusk settled over the terrain. They had reached a natural hollow between two rocky outcroppings, and Elias had decided it was as good a place as any to stop for the night. Renee didn't object. While she wouldn't call it trust, she had to admit he had a knack for picking safe spots. Elias crouched down and began arranging dry branches for a fire. Renee stood nearby, arms crossed, watching his every move. The flickering light from his small lantern cast shadows that danced across his face and the rocks around them. You're unusually quiet, Elias remarked without looking up. Usually by now you've told me at least 3 different reasons why I should surrender. Renee narrowed her eyes. I'm thinking. The gears are turning, he said with a faint grin. What's on your mind? How you managed to evade so many hunters before me, she replied, her tone neutral. And why you're still alive after all this time. Elias paused his work and glanced up. You make it sound like I'm some kind of ghost. You don't act like someone who's been on the run for years, she said. Most fugitives are paranoid, jumpy, desperate. But you seem at ease. Maybe I'm just good at pretending, Elias said, turning back to his fire. He struck a small spark with a piece of flint, and the branches began to smolder. Or maybe I've just come to accept that some things are out of my control. That's a convenient way to think, Renee said, stepping closer. But you're not fooling me. You're up to something. Elias leaned back, letting the flames catch before sitting on a nearby stone. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just trying to survive. Same as you. Renee studied him carefully. His casual demeanor was infuriating, but it was also what kept her intrigued. He didn't fit the profile of the typical fugitive, especially not one the Israni Empire had put so much effort into pursuing. There had to be more to his story. If you're not hiding some grand plan, she said, then why don't you just surrender? End this chase. Save yourself the trouble. Elias met her gaze, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. Because surrendering means more than just giving up my freedom. It means handing over everything I've learned, everything I know. And I'm not ready to do that. Something in his tone stopped her. Instead, she sat down on a flat rock opposite him, resting her rifle across her lap. The fire crackled between them, its warmth cutting through the evening chill. Let me guess, she said after a moment. You think you're the hero of some noble cause. Elias smirked. Do I look like a hero to you? No, Renee said flatly. You look like someone who's gotten very lucky. He chuckled. Fair enough. But luck only takes you so far. After that, it's about knowing when to push forward and when to pull back. And what's your next move? Renee asked, leaning forward slightly. How do you plan to get out of this alive? Elias's grin faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. That depends on you, doesn't it? She tilted her head. On me. Think about it, he said. You could end this right now. Call in your people, take me back, collect your reward. Or... He let the word hang in the air. You could listen. Renee narrowed her eyes. Listen to what? To why I'm here. To what's really going on. Elias held her gaze. Maybe you'd realize that this chase isn't just about me. It's about something bigger. Renee clenched her jaw. She hated that he had a way of turning the conversation back on her, of making her question her orders. But deep down, she couldn't deny that she was curious. This man, this human fugitive, had eluded capture not by sheer luck, but because he always seemed to know more than anyone else. I don't take orders from you, she said, her voice sharp. Remember that. I'm not giving orders, Elias said calmly. I'm just offering a choice. Renee didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention to the fire, watching the flames dance. She told herself she was only staying close to keep an eye on him, to ensure he didn't try anything. But as the hours passed, she found herself listening more than she'd intended. The next morning, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, a maze of towering trees and hanging vines that created a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. Renee moved cautiously, her rifle slung over her back, while Elias walked ahead, scanning their surroundings with an unervingly calm demeanor. The terrain had grown rougher, and their progress slowed as they climbed over uneven ground and skirted clusters of alien flora. Renee remained silent, her attention divided between watching Elias's movements and keeping an eye out for any threats in the dense underbrush. For someone on the run, he wasn't acting like a man in a hurry. He stopped occasionally to inspect a strange plant or take a drink from his canteen, and the lack of urgency made her nervous. You know, Elias said suddenly, breaking the silence. It's not as bad out here as I thought it'd be. Quiet, peaceful, almost nice. Renee raised an eyebrow, though he wasn't looking at her. That's one way to describe running for your life. He chuckled softly. Maybe, but sometimes you have to find the silver lining, right? Otherwise, what's the point? She shook her head. You're surprisingly upbeat for someone who could be captured or killed at any moment. It's called perspective, Elias replied, pausing to pick up a fallen branch and toss it aside. You learn a lot about yourself when you've got no one else to rely on. Renee didn't respond immediately. His words lingered in the air, and she found herself wondering how much of what he said was true. He certainly didn't act like the hardened fugitive she'd been led to expect. If anything, he seemed almost normal. Why did you do it? She asked finally. Do what? Elias asked, glancing back at her. Whatever you did to make the Israni hunt you down like this, she said. Was it worth it? Elias stopped walking, turning fully to face her. His expression softened, but there was a weight behind his eyes. Let's just say I didn't have much of a choice. Sometimes you end up doing things because not doing them feels even worse. That's not an answer, she said, her voice firm. If you want me to trust you, you're going to have to do better than vague statements and cryptic comments. He sighed, leaning against a nearby tree. Trust isn't something that comes easy out here. But if you want the truth, he trailed off as if choosing his words carefully. I didn't set out to be a fugitive. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to help. Renee frowned. Help who? Or what? People, Elias said simply. Families, colonies, communities that were being ignored. The Israni turned their backs on a lot of folks out here. I tried to make a difference. Her eyes narrowed. And what difference did you make? Stealing, smuggling, running off with classified tech. He met her gaze without flinching. I saved lives. I gave them what they needed to survive. Food, medicine, shelter. Things the Israni bureaucracy decided weren't worth the trouble. Renee shook her head. That doesn't excuse breaking the law. Elias's lips twitched into a faint smile. Sometimes the law isn't what's right. Sometimes it's just the easiest way to keep the powerful comfortable. She didn't respond right away, unsure how to counter his calm logic. He wasn't shouting or pleading. He simply stated his case, leaving her to decide whether or not to believe him. They continued walking, and the forest gradually gave way to a rocky plateau. The view opened up to a vast, misty valley below. Elias stopped at the edge, gazing out over the expanse, and Renee hesitated before joining him. The wind tugged at her hair, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. This is the part where you could make your move, Elias said softly, not turning to look at her. I'm out in the open, nowhere to run. It'd be easy. Renee tightened her grip on her rifle, but she didn't raise it. You're too calm. If I tried, you'd already have a plan. He laughed quietly. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of running. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? Elias finally turned to her, his expression serious. I mean that maybe it's time to stop playing the game. You've seen what I'm like, how I survive. You've heard my reasons. If you're going to turn me in, do it now. If not, maybe we can figure something else out. Renee stared at him, weighing his words. Her instincts as a hunter told her not to trust him, to do her duty and finish what she started. But a part of her, the part that had been growing stronger since she met him, wasn't so sure anymore. She stepped back, her gaze locked on his. This isn't over. I'm not letting you go. I wouldn't expect you to, Elias said with a faint smile. But maybe you'll think about what I said. With that, he started walking again, leaving Renee standing at the edge of the plateau, the wind carrying his words away. The mountains loomed ahead, their craggy peaks dusted with snow and shrouded in swirling mists. The air grew colder with every step, and Renee adjusted her pack, pulling her coat tighter around her. Elias led the way, his pace steady despite the steep incline. She followed a few meters behind, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. You sure you're up for this? Elias called back to her. His voice carried easily in the thin mountain air. It gets rougher the higher we go. I'm fine, Renee replied, her tone even. Don't worry about me. He chuckled lightly. If you say so. They climbed in relative silence. The crunch of snow underfoot the only sound for a long while. The climb was challenging but not unbearable, and Renee refused to show any sign of weakness. She wouldn't give Elias the satisfaction. As they reached a narrow plateau, Elias stopped, lowering his pack to the ground. He turned to look at her, his breath visible in the cold air. We'll rest here for a bit. The summit's not far, but we'll need our energy. Renee hesitated, then nodded, dropping her pack a few feet away. She remained standing, her posture tense as she watched him unpack a small thermal blanket and a sealed packet of dried rations. You know, you don't have to act so suspicious, Elias said, tearing open the packet. I'm not going to push you off the edge or anything. I'm not acting suspicious, she said flatly. I'm keeping my guard up. There's a difference. Fair enough, he said, sitting on the blanket and leaning back against a rock. He gestured toward the snow-covered peaks around them. Not bad, right? Almost makes you forget why we're here. I haven't forgotten, Renee said, crossing her arms. I didn't think you would, Elias replied. He bit into one of the ration bars and glanced at her. But it wouldn't hurt you to enjoy the view for a moment. She let her gaze drift over the landscape. The clouds parted briefly, revealing a dazzling expanse of white-capped mountains and deep valleys below. The sunlight glittered on the snow, making the scene almost surreal. Renee felt a small, unwelcome pang of awe. The beauty of the place caught her off guard. You're quiet, Elias said after a while. That's new. I'm thinking, she said, her voice low. About what? About you, she admitted, surprising herself. And what you're really after. Elias raised an eyebrow. I thought I already explained that. You gave me reasons, she said. But I don't know if I believe them. Not entirely. Elias smiled faintly. And what would it take for you to believe me? Renee considered his question, then shook her head. I don't know. Maybe proof. He leaned forward slightly. Proof that I'm not some heartless fugitive? Or proof that what I did was worth it? Maybe both, she said. Maybe neither. I'm not sure yet. Well, that's progress, Elias said lightly, leaning back again. At least you're not trying to shoot me anymore. She sighed, looking away. Don't tempt me. They sat there for a while, the silence stretching out as the wind whistled through the peaks. Renee found herself relaxing, if only slightly. The tension she had carried for so long felt just a little lighter. She hated to admit it, but she didn't mind the quiet moments with him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Elias stood and shouldered his pack. Come on, he said. We're almost there. Renee followed without a word. The path grew steeper, the wind sharper. The air was thin, and her breathing became more labored, but she refused to slow down. She could see the summit now, just a short climb away. When they finally reached the top, the view took her breath away. The entire range stretched out before them, a sea of white peaks and dark valleys. The setting sun painted the snow in shades of gold and orange, casting long shadows that made the landscape seem alive. Elias stood beside her, his gaze on the horizon. It's something, isn't it? Renee nodded slowly. It is. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Renee found herself feeling something she hadn't expected. An odd sense of connection, not just to the landscape, but to Elias. She didn't understand it fully, but it was there, and it was real. Elias finally turned to her, his expression serious. I know you have your doubts, Renee, but I meant what I said before. I didn't set out to be anyone's enemy. I just wanted to do what I thought was right. She studied him, her sharp eyes searching his face. He looked tired but determined, as if he carried the weight of every choice he'd made. She didn't know if she believed him completely, but she couldn't deny the conviction in his voice. I'll think about it, she said quietly. He nodded. That's all I can ask. As they started their descent, Renee found herself walking a little closer to Elias, the distance between them not as wide as before. The two of them stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the alien valley below. The landscape stretched for miles, a patchwork of deep greens and jagged stone crags. Renee had always prided herself on her ability to remain detached, focused, and unemotional in her missions. But now, as the setting sun painted the sky in streaks of amber and crimson, she found herself struggling to maintain that distance. Elias stood next to her, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't speak for a long time, and neither did she. The wind carried faint scents of damp earth and wildflowers, and for once, Renee allowed herself a moment to simply breathe it in. "You're unusually quiet," Elias said eventually, his voice breaking the stillness. "That's not like you." "I'm thinking," Renee replied, her tone measured. She turned slightly to face him. "Don't get used to it." Elias smirked. "Wouldn't dream of it." She took a step closer to the edge, looking down at the forested slopes below. Her mind churned with conflicting thoughts. Every instinct told her to finish the mission, to bring Elias in and secure her reputation. But after everything they'd been through, the fights, the quiet moments, the conversations that had felt more honest than any she'd had in years, she wasn't sure she could follow through. "What's on your mind?" Elias asked, his voice quieter now. Renee didn't answer right away. She looked down at the cliff's edge, at the wind-blown grass beneath her boots. "You said you didn't set out to be anyone's enemy." "I didn't," Elias said. "That hasn't changed." "You also said you just wanted to do what was right," she continued, turning her head to look at him. "But doing what's right isn't always so simple." "No," Elias agreed. "It's not." Renee stepped back from the edge and crossed her arms. "So what happens now?" "That's up to you," Elias said, meeting her gaze. "You know what I'm fighting for. You know why I ran. You also know that if you turn me in, none of it will matter." "That's not fair," she said, her tone sharp. "You're asking me to throw away everything I've worked for, everything I believe in." "I'm not asking you to do anything," Elias replied calmly. "I'm just telling you the truth. What you do with it is your choice." She hated how calm he was, how certain he seemed. It made her doubt herself, doubt her mission. Her hand brushed the hilt of her knife out of habit, but she didn't draw it. The thought of using it felt wrong somehow. "You think you're so noble," she said, her voice hard. "But you're still a fugitive. You still broke the law. And you still haven't pulled the trigger," Elias countered, his tone steady. "So maybe you're not as convinced as you think you are." Renee stared at him, her chest tightening. He had a point, one she didn't want to admit. If she truly believed he was nothing more than a criminal, she wouldn't be standing here, debating her next move. She would have ended it days ago. "Why did you stop running?" she asked finally. "You had plenty of chances to disappear. You could have left me chasing shadows." Elias hesitated, then shrugged. "I got tired of running, tired of being alone. Maybe I wanted to see if you'd actually listen." "Listen to what?" "To the idea that there's more to all of this than just sides," Elias said. "You, me, the people I was trying to help. We're all caught in the same system. Maybe we don't have to be enemies. Maybe we can do something different." Renee's grip on her arms tightened. His words shouldn't have made sense, but somehow they did. She thought of all the times she'd felt isolated, even among her own people. Of all the missions where she'd followed orders without questioning why. Of all the moments when she'd wondered if there was more to life than the endless hunt. "What if I just walk away?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I let you go?" Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then you'd be making a choice. Your choice." She closed her eyes, taking a slow, steady breath. When she opened them again, Elias was still watching her, waiting. Renee turned away from the cliff and started walking. Elias followed, neither of them speaking. The decision had been made. Where it would lead, she didn't yet know. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, Renee felt like she wasn't running from something or chasing it. She was simply moving forward, one step at a time.